Bonjour, peux-tu te
Hello,
présenter?
Matt. My name is Nick Tucker. I'm a pastor of a church in England on the south coast. On a really clear day, you can almost see France. And I'm married to Sam. We have three teenage children. Before being a pastor, I taught at Oak Hill Theological College in London.
Quelle est la genèse de ton livre?
So I was teaching the doctrine of God at Oak Hill, and um, and I remember first sort of studying it and just being blown away, just being absolutely knocked off my feet by how glorious God is and how much bigger and better He is than I was able to imagine. And I had the opportunity to speak at a week-long conference in England called Word Alive, and I thought it'd be great to talk about the doctrine of God. But I thought that probably didn't sound like the kind of title that would necessarily pack the crowds in. So I just was trying to think of a way to talk about these things in a way that would pique people's interest, make them think, "Oh, I don't know. I've never thought of it like that. Maybe I'll go and find out a bit more." And I was also very eager to talk about the incarnation and how it can be that Jesus does things that God can't do and does them for us. So I did that series of addresses in the mornings at Word Live, and then a few people said, "Oh, would you come and do that for us at our church?" So it started to be something that I did for churches over the course of a weekend. And I thought, a friend said to me, I gave him the title, and a friend said, "No, that's a book, isn't it?" I said, "Oh yeah, you're probably right." so so I sort of sat down and wrote it.
Le fait que Dieu ne puisse pas faire certaines choses ne contredit-il pas son
There are
omnipotence?
some things that to be able to do them is a sign of weakness rather than strength. So um, if being good is a strength, then being able to do evil is a weakness. And I think that's often how good and evil are talked about in the scriptures. Uh, Evil is talked about as darkness and goodness as light. So for God to be perfectly light, he can't be dark, but that's not a failure of his power. It's an expression of his power. So God's inability to do certain things is, I suppose, a way of talking about how God is always able to be himself, is always perfectly fulfilled in every good thing. So it's actually an expression of his all powerfulness. I think it is, in that sense, coherent. He can't be weak because he is almightily strong, which I suppose it could feel a bit like a language game talking about it in those sorts of terms. But I think it's just a helpful way of just looking at God's power and his glory and his goodness in a slightly different way to help us to see that God is not like us. He's not bound by the creation. We have the capacity to do all kinds of kind of bad things or weak things, but God is all all powerful and all good and all knowing. And it's just a way of talking about how different he is from us.
Prenons un exemple, la souffrance. Pourquoi Dieu ne peut-il pas souffrir?
Through church history, up until the 20th century, it was basically believed and assumed by everybody that God can't suffer. It was a really important thing in Christian creeds. It was a big part of the sort of thinking about who Jesus is and who God is. It comes back in the scriptures to the fact that God is frequently described as the blessed one, as the God who is fulfilled in every good thing. And in some ways, that goes right back to God's revealing of his name in Exodus 3 to Moses, where he says, "I am who I am." And God kind of claims for himself a self sufficiency, that he's not dependent on the creation. He's not affected by the creation in the sense that he needs anything from it. And suffering, in the sense that kind of theologians use it to talk about this, is a kind of diminishing, is becoming less than you are. And in that sense, God can't be less than he is because his very identity is I am who I am. He's unchanging, and suffering is a kind of way of talking about change that's imposed from the outside that is diminishing. But God cannot be less than he is, and the creation can't change him or manipulate him. And so the idea of impassibility, that the sort of old Greek language of passions, is this idea of something that's external to you that controls you or changes you. And in that sense, God, who is the source of all good things, who is the giver of every blessing, is fulfilled in everything that is good and will never be and can never be less than that. So from that point of view, we say God can't suffer. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that, God doesn't understand our suffering, but it is saying he is the one who is able to help us in the face of our suffering. And it's one of the things that for the early church, that they had to find a way of being able to talk about how it could be then that the Son of God, Jesus, could suffer. And actually, that's a question that comes up, particularly in the book of Hebrews, where the writer to the Hebrews says, "Well, it was appropriate then that he should be made perfect through suffering," recognizing that there's an objection. How could the eternal Son of God possibly suffer? And that is to do with the fact that he takes to himself a whole new nature, a human nature, which is prone to suffering and is capable of suffering. So God could only experience death for us in a different nature, in a human nature. And that is a deep, deep well that we could dive into, but probably we don't have time to do that now. But if you're interested in the question, then the book it's a place to start with those sorts of things. Yeah.
En quoi est-ce une bonne nouvelle que Dieu ne puisse pas faire certaines choses?
It's wonderful that God doesn't change his mind, because when he makes a promise, he will keep it. He won't wake up one morning and think, "Oh, do you know what? I actually don't feel like blessing Matt today. I don't feel like giving him salvation. I think I might do something different." He makes a promise, and his promises are irrevocable. They don't change. That's really good news for us, because it gives us a solid basis on which to found our lives, and it means we can trust him. And the idea that God can't learn is a kind of way of saying, if it was written on my school report, Nick doesn't seem to be able to learn, then my parents would read that and think, well, that's not great. We need to do something about it. But there is another possible reason for not being able to learn, which is that you already know everything, that you cannot add to your knowledge or your understanding of all things. And that is where God is at. He already knows the whole of history perfectly. He knows the beginning from the end. And that's brilliant news for us, because it means that he's not going to be surprised by anything. He's not going to be shocked or find that, oh, I'd made this plan, but actually it turns out it's not going to work because I didn't know about this thing. God's plan for history, his plan for your life, his plan for eternity is solid and sure, because he already knows every possible variable. His knowledge is beyond my imagining. So it's something Augustine said. I could not know the world unless the world existed, but the world could not exist if God did not know it. So that reality comes from the mind of God. He knows everything the other way around from me. He knows by creating. So um, that's really hard for me to get my head around, because that's not how I think about and understand knowledge. Knowledge is something that comes to me from outside myself, but for God, it comes from within who he is. When you really start to wrestle with that, you start to think, wow, God is just so amazing and so worthy of my worship. He's not just a bit like me, but bigger. He is a different kind of being.
Comment pouvons-nous prier pour toi?
When you teach, when you preach, what you want is for the truths, the eternal truths of God to affect and change your own soul first. And I mean, that's one of the things that the book came out of, was that uh, just recognizing how really knowing God transforms everything, and had been a huge comfort to me in dealing with the sudden death of my brother, and then of my mentor at Oak Hill, Mike Ovey, and which is why I sort of talk about how it can help you to sleep at night. It actually changes things for you. So if you would pray for me that actually my life would be built on and shaped by that. So I mean, we talked briefly earlier. At the moment, my wife's going through treatment for cancer, and our church family and friends around the UK are praying for us. And one of the really extraordinary things is we discovered that it was a very shocking diagnosis when we got it. And friends swung into action immediately, and they were praying. And we found, strangely, that we started sleeping better than we had been before we got the diagnosis. So pray for me and for Sam, my wife, and our children, that we would know the truth of the things that I've had the privilege of writing about in our lives, that it wouldn't just be something that we kind of that I've just put out there, but actually something that shapes me and shapes and comforts our family.